Great. So, hi everyone. Very, very welcome to the first of this series of webinars on the ISPA Social Protection Payment Delivery Mechanisms tool. My name is Matthew Hobson. I'm a Senior Social Protection Specialist at the World Bank. And I'm also have the honor of being the coordinator of the Interagency Social Protection Assessments work of ISPA. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So let me welcome you all to the first of this series of webinars. This is really a set of series because the tool that we've been developing on social protection payment delivery mechanisms is so rich that it deserves a series of webinars. The tool itself has been developed by a group of experts from a very diverse, broad range of agencies, all experts on social protection and social protection payment systems. So let me just list the agencies that have very kindly donated their services and support to the development of this tool. They include the Better Than Cash Alliance. These are all in alphabetical order to avoid any diplomatic incidents. But they are the Better Than Cash Alliance, CGAP, FAO, the Government of France, GIZ, the IPC, the ILO, Save the Children, UK Aid, UNDP, the World Food Programme, WFP, and the World Bank. And the tool itself, the development of the tool itself was led by the World Bank. So this is a real pleasure for us to be here, and thanks once again for joining. Why are we here? We're really here because we want to provide you with an overview of the Social Protection Payments Mechanisms tool. This is going to be publicly available later this fall. And we're in the process of allowing everyone to become a bit more familiar with the tool, to understand how this tool could actually benefit some of the programming, and obviously to try to encourage you and support you wherever necessary in applying the tool in countries or programs of your choice. So let me thank socialprotection.org, without which we would not have been able to have completed this webinar. Thanks so much for your time and support and encouragement. It's been great, and for facilitating us to have such a wide audience. Now, let me very, very quickly, if I could flip to the next slide, that would be very helpful. And I think I have to apologize right at the beginning for that rather horrible photo of myself. It looks like a mug shot, so I apologize for that. But unfortunately, I'm accompanied by three rather slightly more attractive people. We have Laura Rawlings, who is a lead social protection specialist here in the bank, and is actually the primary lead and primary driver for the development of this tool. Laura works in Africa and has previously worked in Asia and Latin America, was also the manager of the Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund. So a very rich experience, and we're very happy and welcome to have Laura speak for us or with us. We're also accompanied by Caroline. Caroline was incredibly helpful in terms of driving a lot of this work. She was the consultant that was in the driving seat for a lot of this. She has extensive experience on G2P payments around the world, in Africa, in Asia, etc. 17 years experience in the financial services sector, working with a range of private sector actors, public sector actors, civil society stakeholders, etc. So very, very rich experience, and again, a valuable member of the team. I'm also accompanied by Harish. Harish is a lead financial sector specialist at the bank. He has been instrumental in acting as the bridge between the social protection tribe and the finance and markets tribe, certainly internally, but also through his extensive networks to a much wider audience. So Harish has reams of experience both in the private sector and the public sector in multiple contexts and continents. So let me kick off. I'm going to officially start it now. I've been told to alert everyone that we have a hashtag accompanying this webinar, so it's hashtag ISPA_payments. ISPA_payments. If you feel like joining in the conversation, please go for it. Can we flip to the next slide? And I will be super brief because I want to get to the meat of this. So we have a very quick agenda. I'll give a two-slide introduction to what is the Interagency Social Protection Assessments. Why is there necessary to have a social protection payments tool? What are the core elements of it? And then very, very early on, or as early as possible, we'd like to open up for a discussion. So please get ready to type away your questions. Let's jump to the next slide. A very, very quick introduction to ISPA. ISPA is an interagency process. It's a set of very practical tools that have been developed to essentially help governments to analyze the strengths and weaknesses of the social protection systems, both the system as a whole but also individual components of the system. The tool is supposed to guide the user through a process through which they can, first of all, analyze their strengths and weaknesses, but importantly, be able to generate a series of options for how to improve the components of those systems. So it's based on a number of, or a series of expertise from 25 plus social protection practicing agencies. It's really rooted in the best practices from around the world, and we are very excited about not just the initiative but this tool as well. So let's just jump to the next slide. Each tool, what does each tool have? There are 5 different components to each tool. Every tool has a what matters guidance note. This is really the good practices, best practices in this particular area. So in social protection payments, we've looked at a number of innovative practices from around the world, drawing out what the technical foundations of those interventions have been, trying to distill from that some instructions which will allow the user of the tools to gather further information. And it also describes how the assessment is going to be organized. So the What Matters guidance note is really the kernel, the core of the tool. That's accompanied by a questionnaire which draws down from both qualitative and quantitative work, and it guides, again, the user through a very structured process to be able to satisfy them in terms of them having addressed all of the salient questions in relation to the particular issue. So in social protection payments, there's a range of questions on, as we'll discuss, on financial infrastructure, on the range of payment mechanisms, etc. All of those questions are then filtered into an assessment matrix, which assesses the agreed criteria on a 4-point scale, and that therefore identifies where some of the strengths and the weaknesses of the existing system are. That's all captured in the country report, and accompanying all of that is a set of implementation guidelines, which are really designed to help the user to be able to channel the process a bit more clearly. So I've taken up far too much time. Let's jump to the next slide if we can, and at that point I will pass over to Laura Rawlings.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. As Matthew said, I'm Laura Rawlings. I'm a lead social protection specialist here at the World Bank, and it has been my pleasure and honor to work with a very rich and experienced team over the course of several years now in developing this tool, and we are delighted to be launching it today. I wanted to give a brief introduction before we turn to really to the meat of the tool about why social protection payments mechanisms are important and what this tool proposes to do. So this is socialprotection.org, and all of you are interested in, and many of you practitioners in this field at this point, and know that the primary function of social protection is really about managing risk, and this is done through resilience or prevention ex ante. It can also be done through mechanisms that protect and promote equity in the face of a shock, for protecting income, for protecting and preserving human capital, and it can also be an important vehicle for promoting opportunity. So this is in terms of skills, training, access to jobs, investments in small businesses, importantly investments in human capital and skills. So this is the function and the purpose of social protection, but it's very important to realize that that these programs don't only have to have the correct design, they also have to be delivered properly. And increasingly, in the social protection field, we are paying more and more attention to these types of delivery mechanisms, be they management information systems, be they identification systems so that people can exist in the eyes of the state and receive benefits, or be they payments mechanisms, which is what we're going to be discussing today. And the importance and promise of social protection payments really resides in the fact that they are at the heart of these, of what many of the programs propose to do. So we know that within social protection, there are both social insurance programs that rely on risk pooling and social assistance programs, which are non-contributory support and often transfers. And that's really the focus of what we've looked at in payments, is this area of social assistance and a range of programs, which I'll talk about in just a moment. The real promise of social protection payments is in fulfilling that risk management function that is so central to social protection. So for programs to function well, for beneficiaries to be able to manage risk properly, the heart of that is really reliable and timely payments to the right people. So the right people at the right place at the right time in the right amount. And that is central to the very basic functioning of these types of programs. Implemented properly, these programs can be an entry point to a transformational access to a transformational set of tools, not only in receiving payments accurately, but these programs often provide the first point of contact between beneficiaries and a financial institution or financial services. So Harish will touch on that in a moment, but that really opens up a world for financial inclusion for a range of risk management instruments that can be critical. And then carried out improperly, it can really be a barrier. It can be a barrier where the payments aren't reaching the right people on time. They aren't able to effectively engage in risk management strategies that might even be detrimental. People might get into further debt as a consequence of not having access to these regular, reliable payments. This is obviously an extremely dynamic area as well, and we will touch on some of that in the discussion. We welcome also questions and comments from all of you, but we're all aware of how the role of technology, the role of financial integration, and the growth in these types of social protection programs has been extraordinarily dynamic even in the last few years. And so being able to manage these types of programs effectively across a wide range of actors with a wide range of rapidly evolving instruments is a huge challenge that we face in our field today. And so what we are offering with this tool is really hopefully the opportunity to get our heads around what's important in this area and then use the tool as a way to review payments mechanisms in a social protection program at whatever stage they happen to be in, look at how it's designed, what are some of the strengths and weaknesses, and then be able, hopefully, to use the tool over time to benchmark some progress. So it's really offered as an asset and as a living and working document that we hope will be helpful to you. In the design of the tool, we have focused mainly on social assistance programs and within, so non-contributory transfers, cash and near cash, and within that we have focused more closely on government-to-persons types of transfers and payments. So that's not to say that with some adaptation the tool can't be used in other contexts, but that is the core from which we have derived the work and where we've pilot tested it in Tanzania and in Indonesia, and it does cover a wide range of programs, but typically cash transfers, unconditional transfers, also conditional cash transfers, and public works. So cash for work would be some of the typical types of programs. I think I'm supposed to cover one more slide, so let me turn to that. Yeah. Can you turn to the next slide, please? Thank you. I just wanted to say that we do have 2 other webinars planned with our friends at socialprotection.org, and a big thank you for the collaboration. One after today, where we're going to introduce the tool. On the 28th of September, we will be joined by our friends from TESF, a cash transfer program in Tanzania, to talk about their experience using the tool. So that will be very useful from a user's perspective. And then at the end of October, we're aiming for October 26th, when the tool will be online. We will have a walkthrough, basically, of the tool and how to use it and apply it successfully. So sort of a step-by-step guide going through the elements that Matt just presented. So let me end here. I will be with you for the seminar. I look forward to coming back and answering questions. So let me wrap up here and turn over to Caroline's next, please, and turn over to Caroline, who will walk us through the heart of the tool and what it aims to do and how it's structured. Thank you very much. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Laura. Okay, so we're looking at slide 13. So I just wanted to, before I go into the content, I wanted to explain the different sections within the guidance note. The guidance note has 4 main sections. The first section it looks at an overview of social protection payment delivery mechanisms, and it looks at the importance of payment delivery, which I will talk about further today. It also looks at the main methods of social protection payment delivery that are used internationally and the main components of a delivery mechanism. It looks at the key actors, which I will also review during this presentation. And most importantly, very much the heart of this tool is the assessment criteria that we're recommending for use in the assessment of individual payment delivery mechanisms. We also look at the costs of delivery, various international studies that look to the costs, and also the key performance indicators. Then we look at the supporting environment for social protection payments, because a social protection delivery mechanisms does not exist in isolation. It very much relies on the national environment in order to successfully deliver payments. So it's a review of the financial sector pertinent to social protection payments, so looking at different potential types of payment service provider, different types of financial institutions, different types of financial access points. It also looks at policy, legislation and regulation, and ID systems, as well as the mobile network coverage in a country. These are all supporting factors to a payment delivery mechanism. The third section looks at a country's social protection system, which is obviously, again, vital to thinking about a payment delivery mechanism. We look at the policies, the social protection policies within a particular country, and the variety of programs, social protection programs that may be in existence, and how payments are delivered in various different types of social protection programs, and again, a more in-depth review of the stakeholders, which I will cover during the presentation. The fourth section is really the how-to section, how to actually implement an assessment of a payment delivery mechanism or mechanisms. So it goes into much more detail regarding the assessment criteria. It also gives further information on how to assess a payment delivery mechanism, how to assess the supporting environment, and how to assess the social protection system. It also provides a glossary of terms, because there's a lot of technical vocabulary associated with payment delivery which may not be familiar to people in the social protection sector. So we have 11 pages and A to Z of definitions, from aggregators and authentication, through biometrics, e-money, interoperability, switches, and we don't actually get all the way to Z. We get to T for transaction devices. We also include a bibliography which explains a lot of the information. We cite 70 different works in the guidance note, and also included other questionnaire and the assessment matrices. The assessment matrices are an important tool for carrying out an assessment, whereby when looking at a payment delivery mechanism, the tool explains for each of the different criteria and descriptions on a score of 1 to 4, from latent to advanced, examples of what a latent example looks like and what a more advanced example looks like, which is very useful. Also looking at the supporting environment, again with the range of a 1 to 4 scoring range, looking at a less supportive to more supportive environments. You have the next slide, please. So obviously those people who've joined the call today, there's a reason you're here. You think payment delivery mechanisms are important. If I can highlight some of the specific reasons why they are so important to a program. You can have a beautifully designed social protection program. You've nailed your targeting mechanism, you thought through all about your governance and your monitoring and evaluation, but if you're unable to actually pay your cash transfer, your program fails. So it's absolutely, the payment delivery mechanism is absolutely vital to the success of a cash transfer program. It's also a significant element of program cost. If there are two different ways that we can look at costs here. In smaller scale programs and those programs operating in remote areas, we see costs in terms of the value of the transfer running at around 15%, so it can be extremely high as a percentage of the value of the transfer. Larger scale programs and national level programs, this cost can drop to 2 to 4% of the value of the transfer, and we're looking at a range of figures in terms of dollar terms of $1 to $4 per transfer to an individual recipient. We also know that the payment delivery cost can be a very high proportion of the admin budget. Up to 50% of the admin budget may be allocated to payment delivery. There's also the hidden cost of leakage that needs to be considered here when we're talking about theft and corruption of transfers which are meant to be destined 100% to your beneficiaries. Those programs that actually measure it, and it's not well measured by a number of programs, we have a range of figures from 4% of the value of transfers lost to leakage in South Africa, rising up to 15% of the value of transfers lost in India. Your payment delivery mechanism also has a direct impact on your beneficiaries in terms of thinking about the accessibility of the payment for your beneficiaries, the number of pay points that your beneficiaries may collect their transfers from, the proximity of those pay points to beneficiaries' homes. Payment delivery mechanisms also provide an opportunity for considering financial inclusion. And really at the most basic level, we're talking about providing an account, so making a payment to an account, which enables beneficiaries to make partial withdrawals, for example. Next slide, please. So look at some of the key actors and trade-offs. First of all, we look at government, a very important stakeholder in payment delivery mechanisms. And we know government is not a homogeneous entity, but made up of different components. If we look at the objectives of different stakeholders, sometimes those objectives are competing and may require trade-offs, and sometimes they may be mutually reinforcing and complementary. Program funders tend to be very focused on fiduciary aspects, the security of funds, traceability of funds. Program policymakers and implementers, their objectives are usually well aligned. That's why they're considered under the same point. but making sure the payment delivery mechanism is supportive of a country's social protection policy if that is in place. Social protection policymakers are not generally familiar with payment delivery, but they may have, for example, principles for the implementation of all components of social protection programs. For example, in Uganda, this is the approach that they've taken, making specific objectives, principles for implementation, including inclusiveness, dignity, and equality. Beneficiaries are obviously a very important stakeholder group, but they're characterized by their vulnerability and in particular by their lack of voice. So when you're considering trading off different criteria, different objectives in a program, it's very important to maintain beneficiaries in the forethought. Also to make sure that the needs of vulnerable groups are being considered. That is also absolutely vital as well. Payment service providers, not all programs use a payment service provider, but when a payment service provider is being used, it's very important that there's an understanding of what the business case is, and there is a long-term business case for service provision. Business cases may be based on profitability, but they may have other factors as well. So you may look at the business case of providing individual accounts, so the profitability at the individual account level, or a provider may think about the profitability of a sector of clients receiving government transfers and their ability to cross-sell other products and services such as insurance or credit service to make it a profitable business for them. If it's a very large number of beneficiaries that are being paid, for example in a national program, the liquidity associated with delivering those payments may be sufficient to underline a business case for a payment service provider. There may also be a strategic consideration for a payment service provider. Say, for example, they may provide accounts to social grant recipients at no cost or at a loss because it means they're in a better position to win more profitable government business. A last category may be looking at the mandate. So, for example, if a bank is acting as a payment service provider, there may be their banking license may require them to enter into social activities and require them to provide this service to the government and to the recipients of government transfers. Lastly, if we look at the financial services regulator, they are also a stakeholder. Stakeholders, social protection, people may be less familiar with, but an important stakeholder when thinking about payments. A financial services regulator, such as a central bank, is primarily concerned in financial sector stability, safety, efficiency, but also financial inclusion, and that's when there is a complementary interest here. A financial services regulator may be in the position to provide an exemption from certain regulation or a relaxing of certain regulation that may be beneficial for your program, for the payment delivery. The example would be in the Hunger Safety Net program in northern Kenya, the central bank provided a specific exemption to Equity Bank, who was involved in delivering payments, to allow them to deliver through agents before agency banking had actually been introduced into the country and there was regulation. This was beneficial both for the program, allowing an electronic delivery of payments, but it was also beneficiary for the financial services regulator, who was able to learn about agency banking before the introduction of regulation. Next slide, please. So these are the three criteria that we're proposing for measuring the quality of a payment delivery mechanism used in a social protection program. It's important here that we highlight that this is the quality criteria separate from the costs that may be required to be paid by a program in order to gain the qualities. Next slide, please. So the first criteria is accessibility. And we break down accessibility into 3 different areas. The first one is cost of access. And really here, when we're talking about accessibility, we're looking at the cost of access for beneficiaries of a particular social protection program. So the cost of access for your beneficiary will be the cost of collecting their transfer. This can be made up with direct and indirect costs. So direct costs are things like transportation. If they have to ride a bus or they have to hire a motorcycle to go and collect the transfer, the cost of that will reduce the value of the transfer that they ultimately receive. Therefore, a very high cost delivery mechanism from the beneficiary point of view reduces the value of the transfer that the beneficiary takes home, and thus also reduces the impact of the transfer. One also has to think about some of the indirect or opportunity costs. For example, if a beneficiary is required to close a business or stop farming or be absent from school in order to go and collect a transfer. We look at then the proximity of payment delivery to a beneficiary's home to try and reduce both these direct and indirect costs. Looking at these costs, it's important to think about whether or not the cost of delivery and the location of delivery is similar to other access of other services in a beneficiary's life. For example, looking at how far does a beneficiary have to travel, how far does an individual have to travel in order to reach healthcare facilities or education facilities. If the norm in a particular country is 10 kilometers to reach a primary healthcare facility, then when you're thinking about delivering payments, if you're delivering very, very much closer, that may not be appropriate because you can't use existing infrastructure. Also, it's important to think about the functioning of the cash economy. So, for example, if a beneficiary is receiving cash, we know that cash doesn't have a nutritional value. You want to swap your cash, exchange your cash for goods and services. If you're buying food, you need to go to a market to buy food. If a market is 10 kilometers away, but the program has spent an inordinate amount of money in order to deliver the cash to a beneficiary's doorstep, but then they have to travel back 10 kilometers to go and spend that cash, that may have been a waste of program resources. Thinking about how to deal with beneficiaries in very remote areas, there are a number of different ways that you can deal with the remoteness of some beneficiaries. For example, in the 4Ps program in the Philippines, those beneficiaries in very remote areas receive a top-up, an additional top-up of their transfer value to try and address the cost of access for them. If we look at appropriateness, we're really thinking about taking account of the needs of your beneficiaries. So understanding who your beneficiaries are, and in particular focusing on the very vulnerable groups of beneficiaries, the poor, the elderly, the illiterate, women and the disabled, and what their specific needs may be. This may require the taking account at the design stage of beneficiaries' needs, trying to understand them better, either talking directly to beneficiaries or referring to surveys such as the FinScope survey or FinDex surveys, which provide information about the financial lives of beneficiaries. Training and communication is absolutely vital to make sure that your beneficiaries have sufficient knowledge to actually access their transfer, that they know the value and the time of delivery so they can collect their payments. And also thinking about the introduction of beneficiary choice, allowing market mechanisms to ensure better behavior from providers in a non-monopoly setting. Rights and dignity is also very important, identifying rights and protecting those rights from a payments point of view. For example, having standard timelines for certain activities, the number of, if a card is required to deliver payments, how many days from enrollment does the beneficiary receive their card, or is there automatic in the field issuance of cards? Grievance and redress or complaints and feedback are absolutely essential to have standard timelines and to monitor and oversee those timelines. If a payment service provider is being used, to make sure there is a service level agreement in place and that is monitored and evaluated on an ongoing basis. Also, when looking at rights and dignity, we can also look at the importance of using mainstream payments infrastructure where that's available. What this means is, instead of setting up standalone infrastructure to pay your social grant beneficiaries, trying to have a more inclusive approach of using, where possible and where available, existing financial infrastructure. So your poor beneficiaries receive their payments in the same way that their less poor neighbors may receive banking services and other transfers. So a more inclusive rather than segregated approach. Also, we have to think about privacy of transactions, and this is when we come to data protection and fair information practices. Next slide, please. Robustness is the second criteria, and that's made up of three components. The first is reliability. Reliability is the timeliness of the transfer. And it's very important that by setting a payments calendar and communicating it to all stakeholders involved in payments, from the funders down to the beneficiaries, and then to adhere to it. We have evidence from a number of different countries of the challenges when payments are not made in a reliable fashion. In Indonesia, for example, delayed transfers reduced expenditure by beneficiaries by 7.5%. And in South Africa, there is evidence of beneficiaries, in the case of payments not arriving, social grant payments not arriving, of them going to informal credit providers, which effectively puts them in a debt trap. And when the payment eventually comes, they don't receive sufficient money to pay off their debt, and then they are in trouble in the future. It's also, even if a debt trap it doesn't occur, and you can also see that there is a reduction in the incentives for investing in income-generating activity. To take that risk when you're not sure that payments are going to arrive on time, it can be too much for beneficiaries. Some of the causes of delays in payments can actually be due to upstream fund flows. So the funder of your program, whether that be government funding or donor funding or a mix of both, it's very important to have mapped the funds flow so you have a realistic idea of how many stages are involved and how long it takes. If you have a cash transfer program that aims to pay monthly, but you have an upstream fund flow that takes 40 days, you know you're always going to be late. So you're better in that case to consider paying every 2 months to make sure that you can deliver a reliable transfer rather than an unreliable transfer. Part of reliability is also looking at the incentives or business case for payment service providers and their agents. So making sure, as I was talking about the business cases earlier on about the different stakeholders, to make sure there is a long-term business case for a payment service provider, and also if a payment service provider is using individual agents to deliver those payments, that the agents are incentivized to continue to provide service, to make sure that liquidity management is sufficient. So if we move on to the area of governance, it's important to have written procedures that define the roles and responsibilities, to have program manuals that specifically address the issues of payments, that monitoring and evaluation is carried out, and there's timely and accurate reporting. Frequently you see programs whereby only summary reporting is available in headquarters, and it's very slow, which makes it very difficult to oversee payments and to actively manage payments. The faster that payment information flows, the better the levers and the tools for the management of that payment delivery mechanism. It's also important to highlight that even in those cases where a payment service provider is used, a government program is still responsible for overseeing those payments to ensure that their quality is sound. If we look at security, security of the funds flow, the greater the proportion of the funds flow that is electronic, the more secure that process is. Also looking at the security of payment instructions, trying to separate the creation and transmission of payment instruction or payroll files to try and reduce errors and frauds. Security of authentication, that is using multiple means of identifying that you are making a payment to the correct individual, using two-factor authentication. That would be, for example, the factors are something you have, something you know, and something you are. So the examples of something you have is a payment card, the type of card you'd use at an ATM. Something you know would be the PIN number. So if you're making an ATM transaction, you're using your card and PIN. Or maybe you're using a biometric, using your fingerprint. Next slide, please. So the last of the three criteria, the first criteria being accessibility, the second criteria being robustness. The last one is integration. And integration tends to be a criteria that more mature programs are looking at once they've established their systems. And it's really about how an individual social protection program relates to the broader social protection sector. Financial inclusion is becoming an increasingly important policy objective for a number of actors. And the reason why is because of the evidence that access to financial services improves welfare and also develops local economic activity. It can reduce the vulnerability to shocks for beneficiaries and also support opportunities for income generation and asset accumulation. Providing an account is basically enables savings. Now it also enables a beneficiary who receives their transfer on an irregular basis, say for example every 30 days, every 60 days, or even every 3 months. They need to put food on the table every day, and they have to manage that cash over that period. Having an account may help them to better manage that cash flow. In 2012, the New America Foundation carried out a survey of 84 social protection programs across 43 countries, entailing 74 million beneficiaries, and they found that 64% of these programs were actually paying to an account. After paying to an account, the next thing is actually supporting the use of that account. And there are multiple methods whereby that might be used. The same survey found that 27% of these cash transfer programs actually supported the use of these accounts through a multitude of mechanisms, some programs using more than one mechanism. Those mechanisms that were used included mandatory savings, which were used in Argentina and Ethiopia, a seed account, which was used in India, match savings used in Mexico, Colombia, and Chile, financial literacy training, which was used in Ethiopia, and a lottery, which was used in Peru and Chile. Coordination is also very, very important. So if there is coordination across the social protection sector, or even across the whole government payment sector, to try and take advantage of economies of scale. Examples of this include Mexico. In Mexico, the digitization and centralization of government payments saved the government $1.27 billion a year. In Turkey, the integration of 22 public institutions in an e-government gateway simplified the application process for beneficiaries, moving from the use of 30 different forms to just one single form, and reducing application time from multiple days to just a couple of minutes. Having a payment strategy in place across the social protection sector is really about having deliberate and considered choices and considering multiple providers, channels and instruments, and taking advantage of national ID if it's available within the country. And with that, I will end there. Next slide, please.
Hello, so my name is Harish Natarajan. As it was introduced earlier, I'm from the financial sector. So let me make a few remarks to elaborate on the linkages with the financial sector, which Laura and Caroline alluded to earlier. As we all know, financial inclusion is a major development policy objective in itself, but also to support the achievement of other developmental goals. The World Bank runs a triennial survey called the Findex, and in the last round, which was done in 2014, we noted improvement in the level of financial inclusion. The number one bank came down from 2.5 billion to 2 billion, but it still shows around 40% of the world's adult population do not have accounts. And when we look at the ways to achieve universal financial access, which was a presidential commitment of the World Bank Group, along with various stakeholders, both in the public and private sector, we looked at what are the different activities and actions which will need to be taken by all the different stakeholders. And one of the actions which came out very clearly was the need to leverage the large value payment transfers, like government benefit transfers, remittances, and so on. And the reason why this is important is there are several dimensions to that. The first one is very often the recipients of social benefit transfers are by definition in the lower 40%. And that is also a segment which has high levels of financial exclusion. The second is the reason why when you look at why are certain segments of the society and adult population are financially excluded, you start looking at reasons like there is no the costs are very high for them to maintain an account. There is no use for them, at least there is no perceived use, and then it is difficult for them, difficult for the financial sector providers, for financial service providers to provide services to them. And when you look at large value payments transfers, if they are in a systematic way brought towards electronic means, we can attack all these different problems. So this is one aspect. The second aspect is also there are a lot of other policy objectives which can be achieved in terms of improving the transparency, efficiency of the benefit transfers by moving them towards electronic means, making it traceable, making it more efficient for all the different stakeholders. As per an estimate of the Index, there are about 140 or 160 million recipients worldwide who receive social benefit transfers, and less than 5% of them currently receive them electronically. So this shows the extent of progress which needs to be made in this area. And then also we are looking at a context where a lot of benefit transfers are moving from in-kind to cash transfers, and also a lot of subsidy transfers are moving towards cash transfers. So this number is going to increase, and it becomes all the more important to focus on this point. When we looked at developing, when we looked at this topic, we felt there was a need to look at developing a tool which will help provide guidance to the designers of social protection programs, both existing, when we are looking at existing programs as well as designing new ones, and also to provide a framework for analyzing and developing actions to bring about improvement. And we find this tool as very critical in helping make a systematic analysis in a holistic manner of the different aspects which are needed to be addressed to develop appropriate payment mechanisms to achieve the different policy goals. So in the interest of time, let me stop here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions along with the other panelists, Laura and Caroline.
Thank you very much, Harish. We have to switch here like the mythological sisters and their single eye, switching around with our screen. But here we are. We've received a set of questions, so thank you very much for sending those in. And let me start out by taking a few of them that have to do a little bit with the process of applying the tool and our experience to date in Indonesia and Tanzania. So we received a first question, which is the following. When testing the tool in Indonesia and Tanzania, how have the respective governments been included in the testing? So since this tool is primarily focused on government-to-person transfers and around public sector social protection programs, in fact, the government is critical to this, and the government, honestly, it shouldn't be done if the government is not interested in being involved and in being interested in the results of the assessment. So in each of these cases in Tanzania and Indonesia, and it's a recommendation for implementation as well, it's important that in fact the government be very directly involved. So we worked in each case with representatives, both from the social protection program itself as well as from the financial sector. And so the teams that were fielded, which were also multi-agency teams, this is a multi-agency initiative, and we've worked very closely with all the agencies that Matt had mentioned, and we worked particularly closely with the Germans and also with ILO and CGAP in particular, and also the Better Than Cash Alliance is very supportive in some of the pilot testing, and there's been a big effort. So it can vary quite a bit in terms of who is supporting the government, which experts can help in leading the assessment, but it's very important to actually have the government involved. And in the implementation guide, there are some suggestions about how this can be set up. Obviously, the questionnaire, there are certain parts of it that can go to certain stakeholders. We also recommend complementing that with focus groups and doing some direct field work. So that's in the guide, but the government really needs to be in the driver's seat, both in terms of being engaged in the assessment itself, particularly in helping to develop some of the recommendations, because those are the most important elements, or the options and recommendations coming out of this, and really to be in the driver's seat. So that was one question. Let me answer just a few other very practical ones, and then I'd like to turn over to Harish and Caroline as well to address some of the questions that came in. So there were some very practical ones that came in about does ISPA provide financial or technical support in applying the tool is one, and how long does it take to prepare and carry out implementation. So ISPA can provide technical advice on a demand basis. So if a country is interested in undertaking an assessment, so this is really that demand and interest from the government, which is very important, we encourage representatives to contact the ISPA coordination team, and there's an address. It's info@ispatools.org. That's info@ispatools.org, and there's also information on the website, right, which is www.ispatools.org. It's a website that's cited actually in these PowerPoints, so you can also see it there. And so the initiative does not have dedicated resources for individual applications, but there are a number of partner agencies involved, and the chances are that in a country of interest there will be some technical support available to not only help in applying the tool, but also importantly to be engaged in dialogue and policy options. So that's the short answer for the financial and technical support. And as far as the length of time, there is an implementation guide. There's some desk work that can be done beforehand, and then the preparation, and then there's the application, and sort of the time doing the actual assessment, and then there's the preparation of the country report. So this whole process takes around 6 to 8 months in our experience so far, but obviously this can differ depending on the complexity of the payment delivery system being assessed. But there are these core elements to the tool, and even if someone were interested in doing something a bit more quickly, the tool is an excellent reference for understanding some of the parameters involved in assessing one of these delivery mechanisms. So let me turn to Harish and Caroline to see if you can take some of the other questions.
Right. Thank you, Laura. One of the questions was how can the tool help a government to make improvements and react to inefficiencies in their social protection payment delivery mechanisms. This tool can help firstly identify in a very systematic manner what are the different areas of improvements and gaps. And then also in the same way, this tool also talks about different best practices and how to design a solution. And the same framework can then be applied to help address those gaps, again in a very systematic and holistic way. So I think that's how this tool could be helpful in helping the government make improvements. I will also turn over to Caroline in case she wants to add anything further to that. Then there was a very tricky question of which aspect of social protection payment delivery mechanisms is the most critical one. I think the whole point about the tool is everything is critical in the sense that everything is part of a process value chain, and it's difficult to pick out any one particular point which is critical. But if one has to note perhaps the most common point, it is about reliability. While it is difficult for a beneficiary to travel some distance to receive the benefit transfer, but what is more painful is having to go back again and again without not having certainty of when you will get it. So I think this whole concept of reliability, both in terms of the amount you get, the amount you're supposed to get it when you're supposed to get it, and then also you get it in the form or the way you wanted it. I think that perhaps could be seen as the main objective. But having said that, I think all the others are also equally relevant. So let me pass it on to Caroline in case she has anything, any other points to add.
Thank you, Harish. I think on the question in terms of what's most important, I think that it really obviously depends on the individual context, which may not be a terribly helpful response, but what the criteria, the framework provides is it actually, it provides that framework to enable the discussion of the different areas and to very deliberately look at the trade-offs between different areas. And I think as a living tool, it's actually very useful to think about it in the use of designing new payment delivery mechanisms and also trying to improve existing payment delivery mechanisms, because as I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, there are a number of different stakeholders that do have different objectives, and I think what's useful with this framework, it does apply, provide that context to allow for that discussion of the different objectives and their trade-offs. I would also like to take, there's a question that we had, can the tool also serve humanitarian agencies to assess their digital benefit transfers, and has it been tested by any humanitarian agencies? The development of this tool did involve humanitarian agencies. WFP, for example, was involved, and the tool does speak to some issues which are pertinent to humanitarian agencies. For example, under the integration criteria, under coordination, there is a discussion of the flexibility of existing social protection programs in order to support the delivery of emergency payments. And we discuss the examples of the emergency funding that was delivered in the Philippines following Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, where the existing 4Ps program was used, and also within the Hunger Safe Net program in Kenya, where hundreds of thousands of additional households have been issued with payment instruments in order to allow for the rapid scale-up and disbursement of transfers in an emergency. If I stop there and let someone else answer another question.
Sure. Let me go to a few more questions on the linkage with financial inclusion. So one question is, what can a program or provider do to enable usage of financial accounts? I think this is an excellent question, and it goes to the core point made also in the document and in the tool. It is about the design of the payment instrument or the payment mechanism, which can be under the control of the program or provider. And the design of the payment instrument or payment mechanism should be ideally a general purpose payment mechanism which can be used for other payment needs of the recipient, like being able to receive remittances, being able to make bill payments or payments for other needs. I think that is the key point. And the other aspect is about the education or awareness to the consumer about the payment mechanism. As part of the social protection payment program itself, of course, there's some amount of education, some amount of awareness building amongst the recipients. And I think if, as part of that, if some amount of financial education, financial awareness can be included, I think that can also go a long way. So these are the two aspects I thought in particular would be relevant to help which a provider or a program administrator can do to enable usage of financial accounts, kind of in that sense enable financial inclusion. Now there are some provocative questions about isn't it already evident that the mandated payments do not encourage financial inclusion? And there's another question asking about some data points and examples of that. I think the point we are trying to make here is not about the social protection itself enables financial inclusion. I think the point we're making is the social protection program has certain objectives, and those objectives, of course, need to be done based on the specific analysis related to the social protection context. But given that a social protection payment is going to be made, there are policy choices which the stakeholders can make, which will help also use that as a mechanism to support a greater usage of payment instruments, which has been proven to lead to financial inclusion, because payment service is the most basic financial service. There are examples from China, Pakistan, and a couple of other countries which prove to that link. Let me see if Caroline wants to add any further examples or any additional points.
Harish, I think in the interest of time, I won't make any further additions.
All right, let me pass over to Laura for a couple of other questions.
Okay, let me just say that we do have a community of practice with the team that has helped, that has worked on developing this tool in socialprotection.org. The community of practice is the ISPA Social Protection Payments Delivery, and we're happy to receive further questions and answer those. And I don't think we got to every single one during the session, but we've already run a bit over time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. But please do feel free to go there. Also, the ISPA website, www.ispatools.org, has information, and that is where we already have a short overview of the tool, and we will be loading the entire thing once it gets back from the editor next month. And we will also, of course, be referencing that in our future upcoming webinars on September 28th and likely October 26th. So those are those are just the public service announcements, if you will, to make sure that you have access to the tool. We did receive a number of other questions. I think we will try to answer them, but we will answer them, I'm sorry, in the, online. But there are some questions that have to do with the types of social protection transfers and whether there are in-kind transfers. Yes, there are many in-kind transfers. Food, I think, being one of the primary ones, but there's also an ongoing transition globally, increasingly for using cash, which puts a big premium on looking at payments and how those are managed. And then there is another question that says, beyond quality, can we look at beneficiary preference, acceptance, and trust in the system? We actually define this as an element of quality. We think that, that is actually a very important element in that first block around accessibility, where one looks at the cost of access. That's really the cost primarily to the beneficiaries, also the appropriateness, and also rights and dignity. So those elements are not an addition to the tool, they're actually a central part of the tool. So we thank you very much for all your time and your interest. We look forward to being in touch. And a big thank you to our colleagues at socialprotection.org who helped us organize this and reach out to all of you. Thank you. And please come to the next webinars that are there on the screen on September 28th with the Tanzanians, and then to be confirmed, but aiming for October 26th for a walkthrough on the tool with actually several of the agencies who were involved in its development and application. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Yeah. It's